Hello everyone, Mason here. How you doing? Today, it's time for a chat. It's been a while since I did that intro. Have you missed me? Aw, thanks. The answer I imagine you just gave me was really nice and it made my day. I haven't really had much to talk about recently, but over the last few months, I've read a few books, watched a few TV shows and tried to do a bit of writing, so I'm here to update you. Part 1. Reading. Okay, to start with, for a while I was binging my way through Ross Greenwood's D.I. Barton series. Whilst it's not mind-blowingly groundbreaking, it is a pretty solid detective series, and I enjoyed it so much I read the whole thing back to back. The D.I. Barton series consists of 5 loosely linked novels following the titular Detective Inspector John Barton. I love that word, titular. Each book focuses on a new case with a new killer, and what Ross Greenwood does really well, in my opinion, is present us with a series of serial killers, each of which has their own fleshed out backstory and individual motivations. They all feel different, and they're all pretty compelling. So we've got the snow killer, the soul killer, the ice killer, the cold killer, and the fire killer. Yeah, I agree. The fact that that last one isn't the same as the others does feel a little bit jarring, but it makes sense because the first 4 have winter settings and the last one is set during the heat of summer. And also, there's fires. One of the things I like about the Barton series is that Greenwood manages to keep it feeling fresh. Last year, I got into the DCI Tom Douglas series by Rachel Abbott, and even though I loved that series to start with, after 3 or 4 books, I started to notice a formula that made the series feel repetitive. It became obvious and annoyingly easy to predict what was going to happen. In the end, I gave up on it. Meanwhile, so far in the series, Greenwood has presented us with 5 entirely different killers, each of which has their own fleshed out backstory and unique motivation. They all feel like well-rounded, believable characters that you at least understand and sometimes even empathise with. That's because one of the strengths of the series is the character development, although I do have to say that that's more the case with the villains, if you want to call them that. The main cast of good guys isn't particularly strong other than with Barton himself. Just like Tom Douglas in Rachel Abbott's series, Barton isn't your typical hard-boiled, cynical, world-weary detective. He's a fun-loving family man who likes a good banter with his mates and has a weakness for fast food, which is a running gag throughout the series as his wife tries to get him to eat healthier. Barton is grumpy at times, but mostly because he's starting to acknowledge the fact that he's aging and he's forced to face his mortality, which sounds worse than it is. This isn't some deep exploration of existential dread, it's mostly played for laughs. It's presented as a middle-aged man realising that he's not quite as young as he used to be and worrying about getting left behind as the world progresses. I did enjoy his family dynamic too. It's quite wholesome at times and it provides both moments of light comedy and a chance to get to know who John is as a man rather than just Barton the detective. Holly, his wife, is supportive and understanding of the pressure and responsibility that comes with being a detective inspector. At times, she is exasperated and disappointed by the lack of time she gets to spend with John, but it never really strays into resentment. They have 3 children together ranging from the age of 6 to 16, and again that's played for laughs as Barton is forced to navigate the different stages of development that his children are currently going through. Personally, my favourite is probably Luke, the youngest child, because he's got that lovable, childlike innocence that allows Barton to just let loose and have fun when they interact. As a massive fan of Bones and somebody who fell in love with that team dynamic, I have to say one of the biggest weaknesses is the lack of major side characters, of which there are only really 2, and arguably only one that matters. There's Xander, who is Barton's best friend. They have this typical blokey relationship where they're constantly bantering and making fun of each other. You can tell that there's a deep friendship there though, and any time they're interacting is a good time. There's also Kelly Strange, who for a while seems like she's going to get some decent character development, but by book 5, has been relegated to a minor role. In fact, she's overshadowed in a big way by Mortis, the over-enthusiastic mortician who loves his job and is honestly the most entertaining character in this series. I love the fact that the narrative is split between Barton, written in third person, and the killers, written in first person. There's a certain amount of dramatic irony as we get to watch Barton and his team scramble to catch up with the knowledge that we already have, because although we don't know who the killer is, we are inside their head, we do get to follow them as they go about their business, and we do get to understand why they're doing what they do before Barton does. I was also impressed by the fact that, despite being inside the killer's head, Greenwood still manages to hit us with some decent twists too. Each of the books had their own "oh, no way" moment. It's definitely not perfect, but no series ever is. There's a couple of things that make me scratch my head and go, does that work? And a few areas in which I think improvements could be made, but for the most part I found it to be a solid, reliable, well written, entertaining series, and I'd highly recommend it. Moving on, the other two books I read were Dusty's Diary, One Frustrated Man's Zombie Apocalypse Story by Bobby Adair, and The Last Dog on Earth by Adrian J. Walker, which I purchased because it was recommended by Alice from Alice and the Giant Bookshelf. Link in the description. Dusty's Diary is the story of a doomsday prepper whose worst nightmares became reality when the zombie apocalypse hit. Luckily for Dusty, his pre-apocalypse paranoia meant that he'd installed a bunker in his backyard which allowed him to hide out for 2 years and just wait while everything calmed down. The story is told through entries in Dusty's diary as he gives us an often rambling account of his re-emergence from the bunker as he starts exploring his hometown and setting up a network of surveillance cameras so he can watch the zombies and possibly locate some other survivors. Meanwhile, The Last Dog on Earth centres around Reginald and his dog Lineker as they survive in a post-apocalyptic London. However, I can't tell you too much about the nature of that apocalypse because it's slowly revealed to us throughout the story. Once again, a good portion of the story is told through diary entries, but Reginald is a much more concise narrator than Dusty is. The thing that really makes The Last Dog on Earth shine though is that it's a split narrative. We get chapters from Reginald's point of view and we get chapters from Lineker's point of view. As our three main protagonists, Dusty, Reginald and Lineker couldn't really be much more different. Dusty at times can feel brash, obnoxious and self-absorbed. He's definitely likeable in places, but he's also irritating in others. A large portion of the story is dedicated to Dusty trying to satisfy... It's dedicated to him trying to find porn. I can't lie, that was an entertaining aspect of the plot. I got invested in Dusty's fruitless search through the abandoned houses in his neighbourhood trying to find some hopefully homemade adult entertainment. On the other hand, it kinda comes across as creepy at times. There's one particular neighbour that Dusty always had a thing for, and he's desperately hoping that he'll find some homemade sex tapes of this particular neighbour, and it feels pretty gross at times. Then you have Reginald, who's a much more reserved character. Despite the fact that he and Dusty are both older, blue-collar men, their outlooks on life are entirely different. Despite the fact that both men are living through a self-imposed isolation, the explanation behind those isolations are vastly different. Dusty's was born out of a superiority complex. He thought he was smarter than everyone else, and in a way, he was, because guess what? The world did end. The zombie apocalypse did happen. So running away and hiding in his bunker was kinda justified. On the other hand, Reginald, well, the apocalypse didn't really happen to Reginald. It happened around him. He didn't run away and hide in a bunker, he's just living in the same block of flats he was living in before the end of the world happened. There are various reasons that Reginald is living alone with no one else other than his dog in a post-apocalyptic London. I can't really go into them though because again, aspects of his character are slowly revealed to us throughout the story. Let's just say that when it comes down to it, Dusty is an extrovert who was saved by his own arrogance, whilst Reginald is an introvert who was saved by his passive attitude towards society. Last but not least, you've got Lineker, who's foul-mouthed and hilarious. Let me tell you, despite the fact that he goes off on these almost poetic tangents, Adrian J. Walker does a fantastic job of crafting a narrative voice that really does feel like it's coming from a dog. We get all this detail on what it's like to be a dog, how they communicate and how they experience the world. Lineker's attitude towards life is incredibly entertaining, but also endearing. I love the way he looks at Reginald, his master, his best friend, the reason he's alive, and his reason for living. When it comes down to it, these two stories do have similarities on the surface. They're both set 2 years after an apocalyptic event, and they both centre around a pair of older working class men who, for vastly different reasons, set out to explore this new world. However, I think which one you enjoy more will depend on what you want to get out of the story, because they both have incredibly different tones and they set out to achieve entirely different goals. For the most part, I think a lot of people will find Dusty's Diary the more conventionally entertaining story. It's got a witty, sarcastic narrator who gives you his observations on life and makes a lot more jokes. It's lighter in tone, it's easier to read, it relies on a lot more of the tried and tested staples of the zombie apocalypse genre, and if you're a fan of that genre, you'll probably get through it pretty quickly. The thing is, I do also think it's got some pretty glaring flaws. For one thing, if you don't get along with Dusty, you're probably going to end up DNFing this because he has a very consistent character throughout the story. One of my biggest problems is that the zombies themselves have a pretty bloody ridiculous description, and I think a lot of people, like me, will have a hard time looking past that. There's also a lot of repetition. The zombies are referred to as shroom heads, Dusty names his bunker Stink, and there are a lot of other references that Dusty makes time and time again, which are mildly funny to start with, but quickly get grating. There's plenty of hard-hitting, emotional moments, both heartwarming and heartbreaking. The themes that are explored are relevant to today's society and have some important things to say about where it could be heading, but that's kind of the problem. There's a massive tonal shift from beginning to end, and if you go into this and fall in love with Lineker's hilarious observations, it might feel a little bit jarring when the story gets much more serious. It starts out as a story about a man and his dog, but it becomes much more. There's some heavy topics, and at times that can create an oppressive, hopeless feeling. Some people just aren't going to want that. The thing is, at the end of the day, Dusty's Diary feels like fiction. The zombie apocalypse? Probably not going to happen. On the other hand, it's really not that hard to see how we could end up in the world where Lineker and Reginald are living. It comes down to this. If you're looking for some mindless, zombie-killing escapism with some humour thrown in, Dusty's Diary is going to be a lot more appealing. On the other hand, if you're the sort of person who has an analytical mind that you just can't switch off and you enjoy a deeper narrative, if you enjoy trying to unpack the themes being explored, I think you're going to have a much better time with The Last Dog on Earth. Personally, out of the two, I'd say that The Last Dog on Earth was my favourite, despite the fact that I did find some of the darker parts a bit depressing, and I also felt that Walker settles into certain aspects of Lineker's personality and runs with them, which makes it feel a bit repetitive as the story progresses. I really enjoyed it overall though, and I'm glad that Alice recommended it. I think when we get to the end of the year and I look back on what I read, this one will stand out as being pretty memorable. Considering what I've just said, I do feel a little bit guilty because I recently had the chance to impose a book on Chatty the Mad Chatter, link in the description, which she had to add to her TBR, and I chose The Last Dog on Earth. Sorry Chatty, hope you have a good time with it anyway. Part 2. Watching. I recently had one of those moments where I realised I have a Netflix subscription and that by not watching anything on the platform I'm just giving them money for nothing, and since I can't do anything in life without utilising it in some way for content these days, I'm going to talk to you about that. To be honest, I've been watching a healthy mixture of darkness, comedy and dark comedy. Which makes total sense because at heart I'm a miserable bastard wrapped up in a silly sausage casing. yeah, that's not something I was ever expecting to say. To start with, let's talk about Netflix's adaptation of One of Us is Lying. I enjoyed it. Did I love it? No. Did I get inspiration from it? Yeah, so that's good. I think it chugged along at a decent pace. I can't think of any points in which I felt like it was dragging or got bored. I polished it off in just a few days, so I was obviously adequately hooked. The casting was decent, nobody's acting blew me away, but I can't think of any points in which I burst out with derisive laughter either. At the end of the day, it's an intriguing enough mystery. It's fun trying to work out who's framing the gang for murder and what possible motive they could have, even if it does feel like it's got a slightly contrived ending. The thing is, it also feels like a slasher in which nobody dies. You know, other than the guy who's murdered at the beginning. Okay, maybe this'll make me sound like some sort of bloodthirsty psychopath, but this just seems like the sort of show in which at the end of each episode a character is killed off in some sort of over-the-top, hilariously grisly way. The fact that that doesn't happen, combined with the fact that the show doesn't necessarily do a great job of making me actually care about the characters, means I was just sitting there like, yeah, this show is happening. The problem with a story like this is it requires the characters to act in unbelievable and ridiculously stupid ways. Throughout the show, the whole town is starting to think that this group of teens has put their heads together and plotted a murder. Despite the fact that the gang knows that somebody is trying to frame them, they just keep on having these secretive meetings. Just stay away from each other, guys, it's that simple. There's also the fact that the series requires the characters to be somewhat unlikable because the writers don't want you to entirely trust them. They need you to believe that any one of them could be a murderer, which means they all have secrets they need to keep, none of which are worse than, I'm a murderer. So anytime they're presented with a chance to just come clean and they don't take it, it makes me like them a little bit less. Here's how this show would have gone if I was a member of the gang. In a bedroom with magnolia walls and a television pushed into one corner, Mason lies on his black and grey checkered bedsheets with an anxious expression. Sighing heavily, he retrieves his Xphone Smart Droid Model 5 from the bedside table, checking the caller ID. Seeing Jeremy's name, he hits accept with a look of determined resignation. Listen, Jeremy, before you say anything, I've seen your texts, and I don't want anything to do with it. I'm not meeting up with you. We're not detectives, and we don't need to crack this case. The more we meet up, the worse it looks, so I'm just going to sit back and let the detectives do their jobs, like you should. And as for the secrets we're all keeping, I'm telling mine, you can keep yours if you want, but I'm not. Hanging up, Mason violently throws the phone to the floor, before getting up off the bed and walking over to the bedroom door. Mum! Last year, I got drunk, went for a drive and hit the neighbour's cat. I know that's pretty bad, and I know that I'm grounded, but I'm not a murderer. Oh, that's much better. Try and frame me now, Alright, before you say anything, yes, for the purposes of that joke, I could see, but I was also a teenager still living with my mum, so deal with it. After that, because One of Us is Lying didn't adequately satisfy my burning bloodlust, I moved on to season 3 of Netflix's Slasher, and let me tell you, that one contained the ridiculous gory fun that I was looking for. Is it believable in any way whatsoever? Absolutely not. It all takes place over the span of one day, which makes no sense at all. The killer pretty much exclusively focuses on one particular block of flats in which almost all of the residents are cartoonishly bad people, the detective work was laughably bad, and the deaths are hilariously over-the-top grisly. But it was awesome. Look, the way I see it, you've got two groups of people. You've got the group who will hear the things I've just said and think, that sounds terrible, I'm not going anywhere near it, either because you don't like horror at all, or you just don't like slashers because you want your horror to be serious. Then you've got the group of people that'll hear the things I just said and think, that sounds amazing, and if you're in that group of people, you're probably going to have an alright time with this. Over the years, a lot of people have pointed out that it's kind of weird that I don't like horror, but I like slashers, and that's because I don't like the supernatural. For some illogical reason, I seem to find ghosts more frightening than actual murderers. I know that doesn't make sense, but that's just the way that my brain's wired. At the end of the day, a slasher presents you with a cast of characters ranging from I don't care to I actively hate you, and then systematically kills them off in elaborately grisly ways that are so cartoonishly gory they leapfrog horrifying and land in black comedy. From the stupidly funny detective work with the worst crime scenes you've ever seen in your life, to somebody dying from having their face shoved into acidic toilet water, this show is so bad. There's no way they didn't make it that bad on purpose, and to me that's just brilliant. Don't get me wrong though, there are some amazing performances in this show. The standout for me is Paula Brancarti, who plays Violet, the borderline psychotic social media addict who posts some pretty inappropriate stuff. Violet is not a likeable character, but she is entertaining to watch. Either you're the sort of person who can switch off their brain and just enjoy some well put together gory fun, or you're not. Even if you are, I'd recommend Intoxication. Whatever your favourite substance is, I'm willing to bet it'd probably improve your experience of the show. Before I get to the last thing I want to talk about in this section, I do have some honourable mentions, like Derry Girls, which I only really found funny for the first season, Black Mirror, which I'm not going to talk about because my thoughts on that show are vast and really do deserve their own video. Finally, I'm currently in the middle of Netflix's Ratched, and I'm pretty sure I'm going to want to talk about that when I finish. Also, yes, most of the things that I watch are on Netflix, but that's because they're the only platform that consistently provides audio description, so they get my undying loyalty. However, The Rings of Power is a few short weeks away, and you know how I feel about Middle-earth. I'm excited, I'm going to be watching it, and as I mentioned earlier on in the video, since I can't do anything in life without somehow utilising it for content, you're going to be hearing my thoughts on that at some point. Which brings me to The Woman in the House Across the Street from the Girl in the Window. Yes, that's a real title for a real show that actually exists. Mint, innit? Kristen Bell plays Anna Whitaker, an artist who takes a break from her career to mourn the death of her 8-year-old daughter, a tragedy which also broke up her marriage. Everything seems dire and gloomy, but then a handsome single father called Neil, played by Tom Riley, moves into the house across the street. Anna and Neil have an instant connection, and it finally seems that Anna might be able to climb out of the pit of despair she's been trapped in. Until one night, as she gazes longingly at Neil's window, she witnesses a brutal murder. Okay, you with me so far? Right, well that's just level 1 of the show, because Anna is an unreliable narrator. She's mentally ill, and she's surviving off a healthy mixture of wine and medication, which has led to her sense of reality being utterly broken, and throughout the show, we never know what's real and what's not. Now I'm sure some of you are thinking, but Mason, that seems terrible, it sounds like it's filled with cliches and could be pretty depressing. Well yeah, that's a valid viewpoint. The thing is, you're also missing level 3 of this show, which is that it's a satire. Everything that seems melodramatic and cliche is done on purpose, and it's poking fun at the unreliable narrator mystery thriller genre, which I'm a massive fan of, and oh my god, this is great guys. The show walks a dangerously fine line. Picture it as a narrow coastal shelf. On one side is the tempestuous ocean of tired cliches, on the other are the jagged, razor-sharp rocks of overdone, overblown, unbelievable comedy. Somehow, the writers managed to tightrope this shelf without ever falling off either way, at least in my opinion. To be honest, this show just ticks all the boxes for me. I don't know if you've noticed, but I quite like thrillers, I quite like silly comedy, and this show has both. I can't lie, I'm incredibly envious of these writers because I'd do anything to be able to write something like this. It manages to balance a mystery which actually feels intriguing, some expertly acted, gut-wrenching scenes, and some truly funny comedy which, yes at times does feel ridiculous, but also perfectly captures the spirit of the thing that it's parodying. In my opinion, what makes this show so clever, and why it works so well, is that there's an amazing juxtaposition between the serious and the silly. One moment you're slap bang in the middle of this super serious scene which actually manages to draw you in and make you care about the characters, and the next they're hitting you with this tongue-in-cheek satirical comedy which, if you're familiar with the genre it's parodying, feels spot on. Despite the fact that I absolutely love the psychological thriller genre, I'm willing to admit that it's riddled with unbelievable melodramatic backstories, but the woman in the house across the street from the girl in the window knows this. It takes the melodrama and turns the dial to maximum. This means that on one hand, when you get a character's backstory, it does feel like the kind of backstory a character like that would have in a story like this, but it also pushes it past reality into hilarity. To me, the approach feels like a friend that's known you for years and they love you, but they're also aware that you have a lot of flaws and they're perfectly willing to take the piss out of you for them. Needless to say, I highly recommend this. Part 3. My life. So, in terms of writing, I've been kind of all over the place recently. I've had loads of ideas, but I just don't have enough time in the world to write them all down. I've been trying to formulate the next chapter of The Bleeding Ground, but I've been having a bit of trouble trying to decide what exactly I want to happen in that chapter. I do have a vague idea of where I want the story to go overall, but I'm just not particularly sure how to get there. However, over the last few days, I've had a bit of a brainwave on that, so I think I'll probably start writing it soon. I have a short story called Careful What You Wish For, which is a Black Mirror inspired science fiction thriller cautionary tale. I'm quite close to finishing it, but the ending was eluding me. I was going round and round in circles trying to figure out how I wanted to conclude it, but it just wasn't coming. Luckily, once again, in the last few days, I think I might have found the piece of the puzzle I need to complete it, so keep an eye out for that one in the future. A project that I'm really excited for is this weird meta-comedy I've been writing, where the narrator is aware that they're a metaphysical construct and they're constantly breaking the fourth wall. It's really silly, but I'm having such a good time writing it. I do have other stories in the pipeline, but nothing that I'm willing to mention yet because, well, if they don't work out, I don't want you guys getting on my case saying, "But Mason, you said that you were writing an 18th century splatterpunk slasher fic." Well, yeah, I did have that idea at one point, but it didn't work out, so I'm not doing it. Over the last year or so, I feel like I've been in such a creative mindset that I've got to the point where I just don't have time to do everything. Between actually trying to live my life, keep on reading, having stuff on TV to watch, trying to write The Bleeding Ground and other short stories that I want to tell, working on series like TalkTube and now The Justice Files, I feel like I'm torn in a lot of different directions and I find it hard to decide which one I want to go in. That's not helped by the fact that I'm such a bloody perfectionist that I micromanage every single detail of them, and that means they end up being time consuming. For those of you who actually care for some reason, the walk to Mordor continues and I'm about 1400 miles in, which means I've only got 400 miles left until I reach the slopes of Mount Doom. Yay! Mason, you are aware that after that you have to walk back, right? I think I'm just going to throw myself in like Gollum. Yes, I know Gollum didn't throw himself in on purpose, but it worked for the sake of the joke. I've recently started factoring the local park into the routes I'm taking because there's some ultra-friendly squirrels who literally eat out of the palm of my hand, and it's so cute. I mean, just look at the little guy in this footage. For those of you who aren't looking at your screen right now, or happen to be blind, this squirrel is sat right in front of my outstretched palm picking up nut after nut. He's not even walking away to eat them, he's just like, "Oh, why yes, a nut, I will take that. Oh, another one, yes, thank you very much." Question of the day. If you could hand feed any animal, real or imaginary, and they were guaranteed to be your new best friend, what would you pick? Personally, I'd go with a polar bear because they're dangerous and terrifying, but also just so fluffy and cute. If you've enjoyed this video, the like and subscribe buttons are just sitting there, waiting to be pressed. Now press 'em, or Mr. Squirrel won't get any more nuts, and just look at his little face, you don't want to deny him that. If you've got thoughts to share, or if you just want to get in touch to say hi and have a chat, you know where the comment section is, and the link to my Twitter can be found in the description. Thanks ever so much for spending time with me today, guys. Until next time, take care. For now, I'm off, and you should have a good one.